Hello, welcome to the Cybersecurity Coalition's K-12 Distance Education Cybersecurity Practices webinar. This is one in a series of webinars that we've been doing during the pandemic around issues that have come up in cybersecurity and areas that have come up that have had best practices in place but may not be as well known as they are. And it may not be in as much use as they are. And then today we're focusing on distance education and particularly on K through 12. And it's an area where there's been a lot of discussion about security and privacy issues. And we hope to be able to get to the details of them. The Cybersecurity Coalition is made up of the leading cybersecurity companies, both pure play cybersecurity companies and companies that have cybersecurity units. And we hope that you can use some of the resources that are on our website at cybersecuritycoalition.org. And I'm going to kick things off by handing it over to our moderator, Megan Stifel, who is Executive Director for the Americas of the Global Cyber Alliance. And she's going to introduce the panel, and then after the panel, we're going to have a discussion with Representative Jerry McNerney from California. So with that, let me hand things over to Megan.
Thanks, Ari. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I will quickly run through who our esteemed panelists are this afternoon. In true multi-stakeholder fashion, we have participants from government, civil society organizations in the form of nonprofits, as well as several industry representatives. So joining us from Nist is Davina Pruitt-Mental, the lead for academic engagement at the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education. You may hear this referred to as the NICE initiative. Renee Patton is joining us from Cisco. She's the Global Education and Healthcare Director. Keith Kruger is joining us as CEO from the Consortium for School Networking. And then Keith Bockwald, the CIO for Hinsdale, Illinois School District. Tom McQuillan from Intel, who is the Senior Director of Security and Trust Policy. And as Ari mentioned, at the conclusion of the panel discussion, Representative McNerney will join us at approximately 1 p.m. So the plan for this afternoon, for the time that we have together, is to work our way from a kind of a broader national perspective, beginning with Keith Kruger and Davina, thinking about some policy issues and some existing best practices that Ari mentioned, down to an in the field experience that Keith will share with us from his time with the Hinsdale School District. And then we'll turn to our industry representatives to talk a little bit about the work that they've been doing in their capacities and share. Both members are participants of the coalition. So with that, we're going to particularly focus on the transition from in-school to distance education and the challenges and opportunities that has created, thinking in particular about both technology, security, and privacy. So with that, I'll turn to Keith to offer the national perspective from the Consortium for School Networking.
Thanks, Megan. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm the first of two Keiths, so I'll be Keith K. And what I thought might be helpful to set the context, first of all, COSIN has been around for just under 30 years. We're the professional association for heads of technology. You'll be hearing with Keith B., the second Keith. He's one of our members, a board member, and we represent people like him. They have lots of different titles. We generically call them chief technology officers or CIOs, but they may, depending on the size of district, maybe a director of technology or something like that. And I thought just to set the stage of kind of where we've been, because it's been a 20-year journey around connectivity in schools, starting really in the late 1990s. The federal government created the E-rate program. When we pay our telecommunications bills, we pay into something called universal service, and that funds access, which initially was just a basic connection into classrooms. but of course has become increasingly focused on broadband and Wi-Fi over the last 3 years. And you can see that as a country, we're making considerable progress. In fact, the Federal Communications Commission has set a short-term goal of 100 megabits per second per 1,000 students, and virtually every school in the United States has achieved that short-term goal. And in fact, we're making considerable progress towards what the FCC defines as the long-term goal. That's a gigabit per 1,000 students. And almost half of the school districts in the country reported just this January. We just released that survey. That's up from 36% last year. So at school, we're really making progress in terms of broadband connectivity to the traditional learning location. Also, in terms of devices, approximately 2/3 of middle and high school, it's certainly lower at the elementary school, say that at school in classrooms, they're at a one-to-one environment. Again, that's tremendous progress. We've seen that growing every year. But of course, in March, the world changed with COVID, and overnight, virtually with very little warning for most school systems, they had to dramatically change the way in which learning was happening, and that learning was no longer happening at school, but at home. We've often talked about, some say in the long term, the digital divide, or we've been calling it the homework gap. But that is not only a gap, but a chasm. In fact, about 11 million students that are in about 8 million homes that are disproportionately from low income do not have broadband access at home. In fact, they're most likely to be connecting via a mobile phone that's probably data capped. So there was huge device limitations or challenges. Schools really made heroic kind of efforts in which to address that, although there were some students who really learning stopped months ago for the year. And so as we think about where we need to be as we come back to school or come back to what education looks like this fall, what exactly do we need to do about that? To get to the specific topic that I think we want to focus on today, and that is cybersecurity. Again, as the Professional Association of IT Leaders, we again see, we just released 2 weeks ago our national survey, and for the third year in a row, when we ask what the #1 concern is of our membership, it's cybersecurity. We did this year ask a new question. We asked, do you see that what you are is proactive, somewhat active, or not very, or reactive? School districts are self-reporting that they're quite proactive. In fact, it's been increasing. I have to say, I think that that's perhaps a bit over-optimistic of where we really are. In fact, from a human capacity perspective, less than 1/5 of school districts even have a full-time person working on cybersecurity, let alone the tools that are needed to keep track of that. So to set the stage, I thought it might be helpful to identify what at least our experts think are the main cybersecurity risks. And without a question, according to our survey, phishing scams are the biggest concern. That leads to ransomware and other problems. The multi-state ISAC Center for Internet Security, has been saying that K-12 is really being targeted by ransomware. And that's, in fact, echoed by the IRS, which 2 years ago put out a special alert for school districts, saying that particularly phishing scams were being used to gain financial information. A message comes through, to the superintendent, it looks like or to the assistant to the superintendent, saying, give me all the W-2s or give me access to the latest payroll information. And if you're interested in kind of what we've defined as kind of the 5 major threats, you can go to our website, cosin.org/cybersecurity, and there are a couple of infographics including what are the top 5, and you can see them listed there in terms of what we think is happening. But this moment since March is different, and with students and teachers at home, often on their home computer, often on their not very secure Wi-Fi, there are huge vulnerabilities. And in fact, we know from the Cybersecurity Collaborative that we work with, these attacks are way up since pre-COVID. And, you might say, well, why does that matter? School districts are, in fact, legally responsible for protecting incredible amounts of data about students, obviously the grades, but also just a whole lot of other information that can be highly confidential, that could relate to behavioral issues, could relate to just a whole bunch of things. And Keith Bockwald can talk more about that from a district level. So I want to kind of wrap up kind of a high level perspective, at least from COSIN's perspective, and is that school districts, in fact, yesterday we released a new survey indicating that nearly half of all school districts are expecting a cut in their IT budgets. That's going to cause even more pressure around cybersecurity and the challenges of addressing the homework gap. And so we certainly hope that Congress will seriously consider some special supplemental money to quickly give the FCC resources to on an E-rate-like program. We think the FCC has a program that's existed for over 20 years that has released billions of dollars to school districts, and industry knows how to participate in that in a way that's legal and protects people. It certainly needs to cover the supplemental needs for students that don't have devices or don't have home broadband. But for the topic of today, we also think that there has to be coverage for cybersecurity. A big missing piece of the E-rate program is that cybersecurity is just basically not covered. And we've filed that with the FCC starting last fall, supported by the superintendents and school business officers. And this really urgently needs to happen. And so with that, I'll turn it back to Megan.
Thanks, Keith. That was a very helpful overview of some of the great progress that's been made, but now a lot of the challenges that we're confronting as we're moving to distance education. So Davina has been in a position to see both sides of many sides of this challenge from the government perspective during her time at Nist. She's also previously been in the classroom, I believe, and would welcome her to share with us how Nist is engaging this issue and how the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education is working to address not only the challenge of cybersecurity within the education space, but also now the additional challenges of dealing with additional complexities and vulnerabilities due to distance learning outside of a protected education environment.
So thanks so much, Megan, and thank everyone for allowing us to be able to share. Again, my name is Davina Pruitt-Mental. I serve as the lead for academic engagement within the NICE program office, National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education. That is led by NIST, and which are, of course, National Standards and Technology, and National Institute of Standards and Technology, and that's the part of the Department of Commerce. So I believe that Keith shared some important stats and some data, and they align very nicely with Department of Commerce, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, NTIA, And so their latest internet use data survey, or data, shows that 4 out of 5 Americans were using the internet by November 2019 and are increasingly using larger and more varied range of devices. So that includes the total population, not just schools, but that's an important piece to keep in mind. And even as seniors and other demographic groups reported encouraging increases in the internet use, which we're excited about, the data also shows that there's a persistent digital divide still exists based on income levels and age groups and race and among other factors. So that's something to keep in mind. I invite you to visit the website, which includes a section. I have an arrow there so you can see broadband and another section on cybersecurity. And there's also a Data Explorer visualization tool. And I give kind of a screenshot of that where you can really filter through different metrics, what devices people are using, what age groups, different times of the year. And it's a way of longitudinally trying to see the data. What's kind of interesting is that the last snapshot or the last survey was done in November 2019. So that's right prior to the pandemic. So it'll be interesting to look at how the pandemic has had an impact, especially on the digital divide issues across the US. So that will be interesting to see. And I just wanted to be able to share those resources. Something that I think Keith brought up, and you'll probably hear a little bit later in the presentations from other speakers, is the Nist Frameworks. So one is the Nist Cybersecurity Framework, and that is a framework that gives voluntary guidance based on existing standards and guidelines and practices that all organizations, so including schools and school districts, to better manage and reduce their cybersecurity risk. And the cybersecurity framework consists of the 3 main components: the core, the implementation tiers, and the profiles. The core guides organizations in managing and reducing their cybersecurity risks in a way that complements where they are presently or with their existing cybersecurity and risk management processes. So I invite you to visit the website to learn, delve deeper into the Nist framework. I'm sure your IT personnel at school districts are very familiar with it. But there are also lots of tools and interactive resources that help you assess where your organization is and possible options that you have to help improve. You should also, I wanted to make sure that you saw that there is the NICE workforce framework. So that's really a task that NICE works on. The NICE workforce framework provides an overview of the cybersecurity workforce, the 7 broad categories of cybersecurity, the 33 specialty areas, the 52 work roles. How it's mapped to the NIST framework is that if you do an assessment and you figure out a school system says, okay, we need more, we need somebody to do X, Y, and Z, what you can do then is figure out, okay, where are our employees at? Do we need to outsource? Do we need to upskill? What are some knowledge, skills, and abilities that the particular work role needs to accomplish to complete that task that is aligned to what the NIST framework is sharing our possible strategies to improve. I also just wanted to make sure that everyone is familiar with the 2020 National Education Technology Plan. I thought that it was complete, but it's still open online, and it's certainly an important time to share your concerns and your recommendations related to both digital literacy and cybersecurity. In the past, there's also been a supplemental report that goes along with it on building infrastructure, and I have an arrow there to show you, there's a section specifically on cybersecurity for school systems and school districts to keep in mind, the LEAs, and also a reference to the Nist components. At the very bottom, you also see there's a reference to COSIN, which has lots of resources for the IT staff. So I'm not sure if the new technology plan will include it in the main document or if it will be a supplemental, but that's something that you could look over and see how we can improve that. And last, I wanted to just share that I also recommend folks visit the federal STEM strategic plan, so that under the STEM strategic plan, there are 3 broad goals, build foundations for STEM literacy, increase diversity, equity, inclusion, which of course, going back to that first or second slide on data is an important piece, and then promoting the STEM workforce, which of course includes cybersecurity. So these are carried out by 3 different pathways, or a number of pathways, one of them being computational literacy. And actually I serve as the co-chair for the computational literacy pathway. And within that, there are key federal actions that are needed to address or to achieve that particular objective. And one is promoting digital literacy and cyber safety. So that fits right in with our discussion. Making computational literacy an integral part of education, and expanding the digital platforms for teaching and learning. So, and that includes everything from bandwidth and access, as well as what we're finding in these current situations is that as teachers roll into using the online platforms, cybersecurity is not only an issue, but just the instructional strategies. So we've made so much progress over the year in STEM education, hands-on and engaging students in authentic learning experiences. But as soon as we flipped or had to pivot to an online platform, we're back to that. Okay, we're going to teach through a lecture and worksheets and things like that. And there are so many other possibilities, but in order for those to happen, we need the bandwidth, we need the instruction for teachers. We also need to improve students' understanding on how to engage in an online platform, not only for cybersecurity, but also just instructional. So those are things to keep in mind. And last, I will just, a last little plug here. So the NICE program office is tasked to present to Congress every 5 years a strategic plan on how we are going to build and have a very skilled cybersecurity workforce. Our next strategic plan is due in the end of 2020. So we are currently under revision and seeking input, and we hope that you have input and that you'll join in our conversation. And along with that comes a national K-12 cybersecurity education implementation plan. So all of that, we invite you to participate and share your thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you, Davina. So we've heard from both Keith and Davina on the policy and objective, which we all seek to achieve as we're educating students in the K-12 system. We're now going to turn to Keith B for the practical as applied when policy meets life, and share his experiences in working through the transition from pre-COVID to post-COVID distance education. So Keith, please feel free to take it away, and thanks again for sharing your in the field experience with us.
Thanks for allowing me to present. Hi everyone, good afternoon. I apologize for the background. I'm in a temporary office today using a teacher workroom. One of the bright spots of the pandemic is that we were able to start our $140 million construction projects early, and we expect them to get done early this fall. To give you a little background, I did present to our Board of Education just about a month ago. They were interested in seeing what we were doing and seeing with cybersecurity. I have a couple board members, one that is an attorney in cybersecurity litigation, and another high-profile board member that works for a very prominent cybersecurity company. So I presented some results of what we were seeing, and as Keith mentioned earlier, we're seeing a significant increase in compromised external email accounts, not our accounts, but we're seeing a lot of external email accounts, which results in a significant increase in phishing emails that are coming to the district, along with malicious payloads. We also are seeing voicemail email scams coming in. So what we've had to do is consistently monitor the emails. We've been catching everything, luckily. We've done a lot of education with our staff in the last year and a half that I've been here, so it's paying off for us. We're also seeing, a lot of ransomware. I don't worry too much about ransomware anymore because we have endpoint protection and we have our new server infrastructure that is immutable to ransomware, believe it or not. So we're happy to make some good investments that protect our data and all of our information assets in the district. One of the things that we've seen is an increased strain on our firewalls with the many people that had to start using VPN to access district resources, and the Mitel mobile app, which allows presence for our teachers to call from their cell phone to make it look like they're calling from the district. This has increased our firewall capacity, or the strain on the firewalls, and actually we do have some E-rate monies that we're going to be purchasing new firewalls this next year to be able to keep up with some of the workloads that are happening with the pandemic and the way we're doing business now. One of the challenges we've really had was staff using personal computers at home. And, we've advised staff to use the district-issued laptop because we have endpoint protection, we have the malware protection, we have them managed a certain way, even remotely. But we did have an instance where one of our teachers was compromised. Someone had access to her email for a month because she had a keylogger on her personal computer at home, and somebody got her password. They did get into our finance system, the employee portal, and change her direct deposit information. We do have some processes in place to prevent and catch some of this. So what happens when direct deposit information is changed for a bank? A physical check is sent the following payroll. So we caught that pretty quickly. I did speak to the staff member what had happened besides the keylogger. They also had their web browser, all the passwords cached in their web browser, which is one of the things that will be changing, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So we're all aware of the video conferencing that was going on due with the change in modality of delivering instruction now. And Zoom had a lot of problems with Zoom bombing. I know some local school districts that had board meetings that were Zoom bombed. We didn't want to be any part of that. We were using Zoom very limited in a very limited capacity. And our primary tool for teachers was Google Meets. And we were using Cisco WebEx for Board of Ed meetings. I want to give a shout out to Cisco for providing WebEx to school districts for 90 days. We just signed up for the next year because it has a lot of great features for facilitating Board of Education meetings. We sent a note to staff immediately to adjust security settings for those who were using Zoom. And then Zoom inherently sent out a note that they changed the default settings for education customers pretty much immediately. But we were lucky enough not to have any problems because that was one of the questions that came up from our board. Hey, have we had any Zoom bombing problems? And we walked through that. One of the things that became really clear, we want teachers to be able to send out via Twitter how remote learning is working. But along with that, they don't realize that when you put a student's name on a screen and you share it out via Twitter, that's a privacy issue. So immediately we sent out a notification to staff to let them know that, hey, you're doing a great job. We want those tweets to go out on successful remote learning. However, please don't share the names with the pictures in those tweets. And then one of the other things that came up, which I thought was really interesting, we always have these apps that that staff are requesting. And this was no different. When the pandemic hit, staff wanted to use different apps, and we said, hang on a minute, we need to consider these risks and what's happening with these unpaid apps that are free. So we monitored it very closely. And one of the things that came to me pretty quickly was this Netflix party. And I said, well, wait a minute, I don't know that we want students to be able to use an app like this. However, what staff said, Netflix party, students have to have a Netflix account. It's like a chat feature. So if they're watching a movie together, they can socialize with each other, which was really important because the kids were feeling disconnected during the pandemic. So we allowed it, and the board had questions about these apps. So we're monitoring this very closely. We have a vetting process that's been in place, and we're adhering to it. The last couple of presenters talked about the digital divide. What I would say about that, I've been here a year and a half. I was able to tap into the Sprint 1 million grant as soon as I got here, so we were prepared. A student had hotspots on March 13th when it was called that school was going to be out for an extended period of time. We asked any other students. We went over to PA and said, if you need access at home, let us know. The challenge here is that not every device is going to work in an apartment due to the structure. So, we have to advise students to go to a window or some other location of the building where they have a better signal. So it's just a matter of communicating that out. And I appreciate the work that COSIN, Nist, and everybody else is doing to bridge this gap. It's something we've been working on for years. And this whole pandemic has really brought this to the forefront. So some of our opportunities that we're addressing right now is we're on a replacement plan for our laptops for staff. We'll have a brand new clean image. Saving passwords in web browsers is disabled, and they will be required to use LastPass now. So instead of saving passwords in their browsers, they'll use LastPass. It's free, and then we won't have to worry about those passwords being saved on the computer any longer. And it's an opportunity since we typically would change passwords April 15th, tax day. We weren't able to do that this year, but as staff come in and exchange their laptops out, they will change their passwords, and we're moving to 12 characters with a mix of numbers and special characters. So to address some of the costs with cybersecurity, there are some Illinois bills that COSIN has been working on with the state to try to get some things passed. However, with the state of the pandemic, the state of Illinois, and all the rest of the states, we don't know what's going to happen if there's going to be any money committed at this point. So we're hopeful that we will get some money to address cybersecurity and provide some resources, but everything's up in the air, as you know, right now. So Megan, I'll pass it back to you. Thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to address those in the chat.
Thank you, Keith. We are seeing some questions coming in, and I think after our two industry participants have a chance to offer some remarks from their perspective, we'll make sure that we respond to those Q&A questions so that everyone has a chance to hear the questions and the responses. So with that, we'll turn it over to Renee and Tom. Renee from Cisco and Tom from Intel. Renee also has the benefit of having been in the classroom as well, and so we welcome them to share how industry is seeing the challenge and the opportunities moving from an in-classroom and potentially in-enclave experience to a mix, or in some cases, I know here where I am in South Carolina, not everyone is in the position of having district-issued, I don't think, equipment. So welcome your views on that.
Thank you, Megan. It's a pleasure being here today. And great conversation about the increase in risk and challenges, especially with COVID. So, of course, we're seeing an increase in the use of devices and remote access, and there are multiple different points of incursion into the network as we've seen today. And again, it's really a question of the loss of data, the loss of privacy, and helping districts to manage risk, not only through this crisis, but into the future. So applaud Keith for the work that he's doing in his district, and also Keith Kruger for the leadership that COSIN has demonstrated in this area. So Cisco is known as a networking company, but we're also very much known as a security company. So we're seeing just a range of different risks coming through. And one of the things that we're also seeing that's top of mind for districts is cyberbullying. So that was something that hasn't been mentioned much, but that's continuing to be a concern. And sometimes that resonates a little bit more with K-12 districts because they see it as a concrete threat. So we actually have identified cyberbullying threats that have come through blank documents just by keyword searches. So they look, it's basically white text on white paper, so you might not be able to see that there's actually a threat coming through, but it was a 12-page document of cyberbullying content that we were able to pick up with one of our solutions. And so I think there are all of these different risks, and so that really points to the fact that security needs to be pervasive across the entire network, from the web all the way to the endpoint level, and that it really is, Davina, to your point, it's not only about technology, but it's about people and processes. And I think what Keith pointed out is really critical. It being able to educate and train people on different best practices and uses, and those policies are extremely important. The other thing that we've been trying to do, in addition to people, process, and technology, given the shortages of IT staff, is being able to build automation and orchestration into the technologies. So it requires fewer people to have to identify risks on the network and then be able to address and fix those. So we've been doing things where we can identify malware on an encrypted network without decrypting the data stream, and then making it very easy for a school to know that there's been an incident and to kind of fix those incursions. So again, thank you for the work that all of you are doing who are here today to benefit schools and make sure that they're protected, not only through COVID, but beyond. And back to you, Megan. Thank you.
Thanks, Renee. Tom, anything to add, I'm sure, from Renee's remarks or other remarks this afternoon?
Yeah, thank you, Megan. This is Tom Quillen from Intel Corporation. I wanted to, first of all, thank Ari, Megan, my fellow panelists, the Cybersecurity Coalition, for the opportunity to talk, and what inspiring examples we've heard from some of the participants here. So it's just great to hear the stories of how people are working, particularly from Keith at Hinsdale. It's great to hear stories of how successful they've been at meeting the challenge here. I think there are a lot of lessons for us to learn from this, and in the spirit of never let a good crisis go to waste, it's really important for us to try to highlight some of those observations and lessons. First, one of the things I think people are starting to see is the impact on state revenues. States mostly provide are the primary revenue source for schools, or funding source for schools, and states. Some of the recent studies, there was a study cited by Bloomberg this week from Arizona State and Old Dominion that was projecting the average state decrease in revenue to be about 20% for 2020. As that impact starts to be felt, there will be increasing impact to schools and school districts as the flow down effect occurs from state budgets. And that, I think one of our questions that came up was, why will states and schools have to reconsider their IT budgets? And having been on a school board myself and having played a role in developing budgets, those tough decisions will always school boards and school districts will always try to put students first and the classroom first. And so that will create new pressure on IT and IT security budgets. Keith Kruger noted from COSIN, whose organization just does outstanding work, and we really admire the work that COSIN does. But Keith noted that there's been tremendous progress in both broadband and device coverage, but there's still a lot of work to go. Megan, you mentioned South Carolina. I'm in the state of Oregon. I was talking recently to one of our members of our state Board of Education who said he had just tried to arrange a meeting with the schools in Mitchell, Oregon, where they have no internet access to offer students at all. So there's still a ways to go, and it's there are areas where broadband just has not reached, and that should continue to be a priority, we hope, for policymakers and Congress. I think one of the other key learnings from this opportunity, from this terrible opportunity that we're managing right now, is to observe the experience that districts have had in responding in a time of crisis. And I think for the most part, the response has just been tremendous. I know in our home district here in the Beaverton School District here in the suburbs of Portland, the team literally overnight, within 8 hours, was able to deploy VPNs, soft phones, and devices to core staff within about 8 hours from making the decision to be able to go online as the primary mode of engagement with students this year. But in the private sector, we have the opportunity to do drills and simulations, testing, research experiments on how we will react and respond when a crisis comes up. In schools, that's commonly done around things like physical threats or natural threats, tornado drills, and things like that. Cyber drills are far less common, cybersecurity drills. And I think maybe there are opportunities for school districts to learn from this experience and make progress towards the kind of goals and journey that it sounds like Keith Bockwalt at Hinsdale has made tremendous progress at there in Hinsdale. I think that many districts are not at the level of maturity in their cybersecurity operations that Hinsdale is, and that there is tremendous diversity out there in the level of cybersecurity readiness around the country in our school districts. What we would hope for is that over time, people not only are able to adopt the kinds of more sophisticated ransomware protections, firewall protections, and VPN services that Keith described as having implemented in Hinsdale, but also be able to do things that help identify more subtle, novel threats and attacks, things that can be detected using tools like artificial intelligence and machine learning that can detect behaviors and prevent people from making mistakes that amplify attacks. One of the, just to close, Megan, I just think one of the most important things that COSIN and our school districts and our policymakers can do is really to reinforce the culture of security that is required among students, parents, communities, and our school staffs. The conversation about security is just so critical. Keith talked a little bit about the idea that they hadn't had too many problems with things like the so-called Zoom bombing. But I've personally talked to some students and teachers who experienced kids who thought it was funny to share passcodes or links for online meetings for their class, and did it in a spirit of fun without a deep understanding of the security risks and the feeling of trespass and interference and disruption that would cause for schools and students. shifting that culture and making people more aware of new threats and the new emerging character of denial of service attacks is really, really important. And so I hope that becomes a focus for us as well. Thanks, Megan.
Hey, Megan, this is Keith. I just have one comment to Tom. I appreciate you mentioning that about the video conferencing. What we've noticed is, the academic integrity is more prevalent with video conferencing or testing now at home. We've had some incidents where students were sharing Google Docs, and we have the ability to track all that. So what we had to tell the teachers is this is no different than being in the classroom at school. Just follow the procedures for contacting the dean and addressing those behaviors as we continue to do this remote learning.
Thanks, Keith. Good points there. So I would invite all of our panelists to turn on their cameras so we can move into some open discussion and questions and answers. There are some questions that have come in from the audience, so I'll quickly answer a couple of those myself and then turn back to the panelists who answered. With regard to the slides, yes, I believe they will be circulated to everyone who registered within the next 48 hours or so. A similar question perhaps came in around the resource list for the program, and I know obviously the slides will contain the materials that were covered by the panelists. Davina, I don't know if you wanted to add anything further to the resource list question.
For the PowerPoint?
Well,
I'm sorry.
If there were any other resources beyond what will be in the PowerPoint that you wanted to point folks to?
I think there are lots of links within all of our slide decks, so I think those would be great.
Sure, good, thanks.
And then I tried to also include in some of the questions, I don't know if some of the folks, they were asking, where can you get content in terms of digital literacy? And there's a big plethora of content. That particular topic has been within the school system for quite some time with the educational technology standards, ISTE standards. Now, how well they're done is a whole different story, but there's lots of resources and privacy is another. So I Keep Safe, NetSmarts, Common Sense Media. I know DHS in their CISA role has some cybersecurity tips, if you will. And I know that our K-12 subgroup within the NICE working group has put together a Weebly site that has lots of resources as well. So those were all included.
Megan, this is just, I'll put in a plug for Keith Kruger's organization here to the COSIN.org website. In addition to the NIST and NTIA resources, is very good. And Keith's organization has actually published an excellent cybersecurity considerations document that may be useful both for policymakers to review and certainly for CIOs and decision makers in the school districts. But the benefit of Keith's document, I think, is that it does cover some of the imperatives around security basics and some of the policy initiatives that would be worthwhile for policymakers to consider.
Tom, thanks for that. We do have a very active cybersecurity committee that meets on a regular basis to provide resources and look at what are those things that we need to address in the education community.
And one of the things that COSIN has done, there are a lot of resources, as Davina said, for helping students and teachers, including, I'd also point to Common Sense Media. One of the things that COSIN has also tried to do is to create around the flip side of cybersecurity privacy. And we've created a trusted learning environment seal. It's a voluntary seal for school districts to achieve, and they have to achieve all 25 practices that we've identified. And it's been endorsed by the superintendents and the business officers and the Curriculum Association, ASCD.
That's great. So just maybe a question for the Keiths. In thinking about the rise of phishing, as you've mentioned, and ransomware, the Global Cyber Alliance, where I'm the executive director, we've been a major champion of DMARC, which for those who don't know what that stands for, it's domain-based messaging, authentication, and reporting. And it's one capability that can be deployed to enhance email security. It's not a silver bullet. But I'm wondering if you happen to know kind of the percentage of school districts that have DMARC employed on their domains, or if this is an area where an organization like ours that has some free resources around DMARC deployment could help support the implementation and thereby reduce the risk of phishing.
Megan, that is a great point. I actually wrote a blog post many years ago with COSIN on this exact topic. There have been, I can't say how many districts and even organizations that weren't using the DMARC records to prevent spoofing and such. I think there's been more of an awareness through COSIN state chapters, because we talk about this all the time. There's presentations, and we get a lot of feedback that people are implementing this technology to be able to prevent some of the email phishing or some of the spoofing that goes on with email messages.
Good, that's great to hear. Then a question has come in around for Tom or Keith about how they utilize SIMs for staff utilizing personal laptops. Are you able to determine the source they are using to log into your servers and cloud-based app?
So I can answer that. So we don't have a SIM right now. It's actually, I have it budgeted for next year, but we do monitor our firewall logs daily. So in school districts, as Keith mentioned, we don't always have a resource for every particular technology. So we have to wear many hats. I get a daily report, and we review the logs, we see what's happening, and then we also have live alerts going on. So for example, our security director at home wanted access to the security camera system remotely. He didn't want to use the VPN, so we set up SSL for it. But now we monitor every time that he comes in, and we see those alerts come in. I have them going into a bucket in my email, me and my team, so we can monitor all that activity. So I'd rather have some other logging tool, which I'll have next year, but right now it's more of a manual process where we have the alerts coming in, we monitor, and then verify, and then have to look at it if it's something that's a potential threat.
So maybe a quick follow-up on that, Keith and others, is Keith K had mentioned the top risks to schools. I think one question that I'm not sure that we've really touched on is kind of the top 5 practices. We spoke briefly about email security, but for school districts that are potentially not as advanced as they would like to be, and we've spoken a little bit about the divide across the country, where, I guess, first to the Keiths, where would you recommend school districts spend their first few extra calories, so to speak?
I prefer to Keith B, because I know he just took over at a new school district, so he had to start all over.
So I really think, to answer that question, is obviously COSIN, Nist resources, and connecting with our colleagues. We have very strong state chapters, and just reaching out to colleagues in the field and talking about your experiences. I can tell you that every time that we have a meeting, this is a topic. Even in our district, I run our operations cabinet. It's an ongoing agenda. We also do simulations with my tech team at every tech team meeting that we have as well. But to fully answer the question, again, it's reaching out to your colleagues and peers and other organizations like COSIN and Nist to provide some of those tools to be able to help you find the toolkit that's going to help you out in your district, and to do those assessments as well. I've used both Nist and the COSIN cybersecurity checklists, and it basically is that dipstick test to tell you where you're okay, that's you still need to watch, or those other areas that say, I really need to pay more attention to this.
And just this last week, EdTech magazine put out an article showing the alignment between the Nist Framework and COSIN's Trusted Learning Environment seal.
I think the other thing, just to add on to that, is being able to leverage these tools, but also kind of looking at it as, before, during, and after an attack. So what can they really do to prepare in the event of an attack? What can they do during? And then how can they remediate? So I think being able to have access to best practices and use cases, which we can also provide, Megan, I'm happy to provide a link on this as well, to say, here's what others are doing in the community, and these are some things you might consider. And I love the idea of them having a community. So districts having a community or a group responsible for looking at things like multi-factor authentication, identity access and control, all these different things where there might be a gap, and they look at best of breed partners to be able to address some of those gaps.
And Renee, I would say this too, that first and foremost, obviously the security awareness to staff is paramount. We know that staff there's a lot to learn about cybersecurity and what to look for and phishing emails and such. However, there should be policies that back it up first and foremost in your districts. Information security policy with an incident response plan. When I came into Hinsdale, we didn't have anything. So it's one of the first things I did was put the policy together with the administrative procedures, probably about 30 pages or so long. But it's our guidance now where it's been approved by the board, and we follow that. So it talks about password changes, how many times a year we do those. It talks about our assets and how we manage our assets. So I think having those guiding principles first, and also so important to that incident response plan, be proactive instead of reactive. If you have a plan that's in place, follow the steps in the plan, because that is your guide to work through an incident.
Well, and I think, Keith, that is such a critical point. And I don't know about all of you, but at Cisco, we get phished on a regular basis. So that's part of our policy. It's part of our process and our procedures, is that we're constantly getting phished because they're trying to help us from a training perspective to understand how to identify those sort of, malicious emails or where we might have an incursion into the network. And that's part of the policy.
So regular training, I'm hearing a lot of similarities between other sectors and ecosystems that are managing cybersecurity risk. I'm wondering if, in particular, if there's anything unique about the education space that others, perhaps Davina and Renee and Tom, can share that they've seen unique challenges in the education space as opposed to what we might call regular remote working as opposed to distance education. We talked a little bit about student privacy as one particular aspect. Are there other things that we need to be thinking about as policymakers are addressing this transition?
Well, number one, we're dealing with minors, so
A lot of
right there. But I'm sure there's a more detailed answer that should be answered.
Keith, this is Tom. I was going to say exactly the same thing, that you're starting with 5-year-olds and, certainly all the way up to 18-year-olds. But I'm sure all of us with kids in that age range debate whether the 5-year-old or the 18-year-old is safer online. I'm not always sure it's the 18-year-old, even though we might expect that. At any rate, I think that in general, we tend to assume that schools are safe places, that in general we assume that our children are in good hands, that teachers have our children's best interests at heart, and all those things are generally true. But we can be lulled to a sense of overconfidence in that environment where we assume that schools are just going to be okay. And in fact, I think what we're seeing is that schools are increasingly being seen as attackers as ripe targets for attack, and that they are being seen as a rich source of information, of personal information about teachers, about students, and that when those information resources and that personal information is inadequately protected, or where we don't have sufficient security practices, we really put kids at risk for the long term. And so I hope that we can just generally shift the culture and our understanding to be more sophisticated and nuanced about what the security requirements are in those environments.
And to add on to that, excuse me, Davida. So to this point that Tom mentioned, I think sometimes people think, well, student data, there's not, how much information do they really have? They're 5 years old. But, I think there's health records, behavior records, discipline records, a lot of times parental information, income levels, addresses, social security numbers, individualized education plans. So there is, just to Tom's point, this wealth of information that we may not even consider, including information from their parents.
It certainly highlights the need to, for all of us to ensure, as in our engagements, that we're emphasizing the need for good cyber hygiene, not only in our work lives and at home, but also in our engagements with the school districts. I know we're waiting a minute here on the congressman to join us. So, Davina, I wasn't sure if you had one more thing to add.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that, so part of the federal STEM strategic plan is really focusing on, we're collecting data now on best practices, on finding a federal definition of best practices, of scouring the idea about how do we engage more, make a bigger impact in that digital literacy, cyber awareness component. So that's one thing that, we are working across all the federal agencies, and we're also seeking input from other groups. In addition, the Stop, Think, Connect campaign. So that's an important piece, and it goes year round. NICE has a cybersecurity career awareness campaign. And so we work with our partners more on the workforce piece, but of course we have those tied into the cybersecurity awareness. We also have there are a variety of professional development opportunities, teachers. You're seeing kind of an uptick in making cybersecurity awareness more an important component in the educational system.
Thanks, Davina. I do think it's a unique opportunity for us to really raise the hygiene level. Hopefully others are not getting the horrible feedback from them. To raise the hygiene level across the country, as much as it is a challenge. There are students, I would be interested in the statistics of students in each hospital who are now trying to learn remotely, and the opportunity to use this, as someone said, this crisis to help really raise the level of hygiene across the ecosystem, not only in the education space, but also, as we've heard, how that might impact other individuals in the house, their professional engagements as well. So I want to thank our panelists. I know we're waiting for the moment for the congressman to join us. There was one more question in the Q&A on let's see. Considering the security recommendation.
I hate to, sorry to interrupt you. Can you hear me now? I'm on audio only.
Thanks, Congressman. Yes, we will table our question. Thank you for joining us.
I'm pleasure to be here. Sorry I couldn't make it on video.
That's okay. Why don't I just go ahead and introduce you, and we can keep things moving along here so that you have an opportunity. I'm Ari Schwartz. I'm the coordinator for the Cybersecurity Coalition. It's really a pleasure to have Representative Jerry McNerney here today to give us his closing thoughts on our discussion. Congressman McNerney represents the 9th District of California and actively participates on a number of issues in both education and the technology areas. In March of this year, the Congressman was one of the first to raise concerns related to access to distance education and remote learning services. He sits on the Commerce Committee and the Science Committee, and he's also of relevance, and he's also a member of the House STEM Education Caucus, the Cybersecurity Caucus, the Public Education Caucus, the High Tech Caucus, and is the co-chair of the Wi-Fi Caucus. I also have it on very good authority member of your family that it is your birthday today, too. So we really appreciate you joining us on your birthday, and happy birthday to you, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Ari. I appreciate that. It is my birthday, but it's another day like every other, and it's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the Cybersecurity Coalition and Venable for having me here today, and thank you, Ari, again for the introduction. I understand you and my son are friends, so I appreciate that connection as well. I am delighted to be here today. Cybersecurity has been a very strong interest of mine, and I've been long concerned about the growing number of cyber threats that we're facing over the entire spectrum of cyber usage in our country today. But something that's really caught my eye lately is the rapidly increasing number of cyber attacks that schools and students have been victims of. For example, last year, K-12 institutions experienced 348 publicly disclosed cyber incidents, ranging from data breaches to phishing scams to ransomware attacks. That's more than 3 times the number of similar incidents in the year before. So it's increasing dramatically now. Since 2006, we've seen 867 cyber security-related incidents. The reality is that schools in our country have become a major target of cyber attacks. In fact, earlier this year, the Lodi Unified School District, which is in my congressional district, experienced a data breach that affected 2 of its schools. And also, Pittsburgh Unified School District, which is just outside of my district, was hit by a ransomware attack. And we're seeing these incidents taking place all over the state. For example, at the end of last year, the San Bernardino City Unified School District computer system was crippled by a ransomware attack. These incidents I've described all took place before the COVID pandemic. When the pandemic hit, schools had to scramble and quickly switch to distance learning. And this has introduced new vulnerabilities. For example, with distance learning, we've also increased the attack surface for cyber incidents. Students' computers are now connected to personal routers that are often connected to many other IoT devices in their homes. This gives me significant pause given the large percentage of IoT devices that are in use today with little or no security. Last Congress, I introduced the Securing IoT Act, which would establish baseline security standards for IoT devices and require that devices be certified to meet those standards. I'm continuing to work on this legislation and will be introducing it later this year. In addition to increasing the potential surface for attacks, we've also seen increase in other cyber incidents take place, such as Zoom bombing. I personally haven't experienced this, but I've certainly heard about how devastating that can be. This is incredibly concerning given the large number of schools that are relying on Zoom for conducting lessons and communicating with students. Back in April, I led a letter to Zoom raising concern about the company's privacy and security practices. One of the key things that drove my decision to send this letter was the potential impact on students that are relying on Zoom for distance learning. There are a range of issues that we will have to address to make sure that students and schools are protected from cyber threats. This includes ensuring that schools have the appropriate security software and protocols in place, conducting regular cyber hygiene training for administrators, adopting IoT security standards and certification for consumer devices, and ensuring that learning platforms that students act with are secure. So that's my presentation. Thanks again for the opportunity to participate, and I look forward to seeing what comes of this.
Thank you very much. Can I ask you a quick follow-up question?
Sure thing.
So one area that has come up came up on the panel that I think is of great interest to certainly to the schools, but I think also to parents out there as well is we're hearing that that at the same time we face these new risks, that the IT budgets of schools are getting cut because they have less money, obviously. I know that you've pushed hard to try and get more money for states and localities and for distance learning. How do we make sure that cybersecurity is able to get reimbursed in that kind of funding?
That's a good question, Ari, and a tough one. And I know that you know it's a tough question. We've seen our school budgets be very vulnerable right now. State income and local incomes have been cut because of lack of reduction in revenues. So schools are necessarily facing very grim choices. And what we try to do in the federal government and the HEROES Act is provide almost $1 trillion funding for state and local governments. And that, if that gets passed through the Senate, which I believe the Senate should and will pass in one form anyway, will help quite a bit. Now, I don't want to be specifying how that money is spent, but I think it's going to have to be up to the local communities and states to decide how to allocate that money. And we're going to have to understand on our side what the implications of those decisions are before we sort of give them approval on that. So this is a tough question. Cybersecurity for our schools is very important, but we don't want to get caught up in a race for tough dollars with actual school budgets for carrying on their activities.
Understood. Well, thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And thank you again to the panel, to Megan, Keith, Davina, Renee, and Tom. And we really appreciate you joining us. Please stay in tune for further information on this topic from the Cybersecurity Coalition and to more webinars that we're going to be doing in the future. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Ari.